Now, life can be pretty overwhelming. We have millions of things all around us competing for our attention every single day, and the increased number and variety and potency of highly rewarding stimuli has resulted in record-breaking levels of depression, anxiety, and ADHD. Whether it's like sugar or shopping or social media, we all engage in these different behaviours that we wish we didn't, or to some extent, we regret. But luckily, it's not too late to do something about it. The truth is, the odds are largely stacked against us when it comes to avoiding these pleasurable activities because of the interaction of three things. Firstly, we evolved to thrive in scarcity. Basically, during our hunter-gatherer days, food, resources, and stuff like that were super hard to come by. So those of us with the greatest motivation to seek the stuff out were at an advantage. And because obtaining this pleasurable stuff resulted in the release of a neurochemical reward, our brain has now evolved to be really, really motivated, even to this day, to seek out pleasurable stuff. Secondly, there's an abundance of pleasure. We no longer have to work that hard to do or to get anything. Like, if we're feeling hungry, we can just click on our phone and the food will be delivered to our door. If we're feeling bored, we can go on Instagram and check out the latest notifications. If we're feeling lonely, we can go onto a certain app and swipe right and hopefully someone will match with us and we can start a conversation. Like, the sort of intense motivation to seek out neurochemical rewards that served our ancestors so well now leads us to overconsumption and overstimulation. Thirdly, the opportunity to overconsume. So today we don't really have to spend any of our time thinking about or worrying about basic survival skills. So we can redirect all of that energy into more pleasurable activities. Our ancestors couldn't have spent all day playing video games, but today we can do what we like with very little, if any, consequences. So these three things work together to create this dangerous cycle of overstimulation and overindulgence, and it's all driven by the neurochemical called dopamine. Now, we often think that dopamine is the happy chemical that's released whenever we receive pleasure, but that's not true. It's actually the chemical that motivates us to seek out that pleasure. And social media and video games and stuff like that all use these different tactics designed to make that thing addictive by triggering frequent and intense dopamine releases. For example, take social media. They use a tactic from the world of gambling known as variable reward. And the idea is that whenever we go onto Instagram or Facebook or YouTube or whatever social platform we use, we don't know what we're going to see, we don't know what notifications we're going to have, we don't know who's going to have liked our content, who would have commented on our content, who would have seen our content, and things like that. And this keeps us in this constant state of anticipation and curiosity and makes us highly, highly engaged with the platform.
The algorithms that they've incorporated function on the most powerful way to keep people doing a behavior, or an animal for that matter, is intermittent random reward, or random intermittent reward, that you don't know when you're going to hit the jackpot.
Now, the main problem with this is that the more we engage with these high dopamine activities in the short term, the less good we're going to feel in the long term. In fact, neuroscientists have discovered that pain and pleasure are processed in the same part of the brain. So if we feel in pain, then we can't feel pleasure, and vice versa. I guess you can imagine this system kind of like a seesaw, where it can either tilt in the direction of pain or tilt in the direction of pleasure. So when we engage in a high dopamine activity, we're essentially pushing down on the pleasure side of the seesaw, which makes us feel good. And consequently, that lifts up the pain side of the seesaw, alleviating any pain we may be feeling. But there's a catch. Our brain has this natural tendency to want to balance out the seesaw, seeking what's known as homeostasis. So if we keep piling pressure and weight onto the pleasure side of the seesaw by overindulging in pleasurable things, then our brain's naturally going to heap more weight onto the pain side of the seesaw to try and balance out this system. As a result, we get locked into this cycle of overindulgence because, one, we kind of build up this tolerance to the pleasure. Basically, every experience of pleasure has less of an impact because it's pushing against more weight on the pain side. And secondly, we may eventually set our default balance to pain. In other words, if our brain's constantly piling on weight onto the pain side of the seesaw in order to balance out all the pleasurable things that we're doing, it will eventually start piling on weight onto the pain side even when we're doing nothing pleasurable at all. So our default state basically becomes one where we feel bad rather than neutral. Now we have a better understanding of our brain's natural motivations for overindulgence. We can learn to circumvent these motivations and break the cycle, and there are three key tools to reset the balance. So the first tool is stimulus control. Now, this idea is similar to Dr. Cameron Sepper's idea of dopamine detoxing and dopamine fasting, but these are phrases that I kind of want to avoid because they're a little bit controversial and also not entirely precise.
In the last 5 years or so, there's been a trend in Silicon Valley tech executives to do a dopamine fast. When you're doing a dopamine fast, you're not fasting from dopamine. What you're doing is you're fasting from the substances or the behaviors that cause a release of dopamine in the reward pathway.
Basically, we want to abstain from doing pleasurable things and do so in a way that is minimally disruptive to our lives so that we can recalibrate this mental seesaw. By allowing ourselves to feel bored or to feel lonely or to find pleasure in simpler, more natural activities, we can regain control over our lives and address compulsive behaviours that interfere with our happiness. Stimulus control largely involves three things. Firstly, spatial restrictions. So we want to make it physically harder for us to engage in that high dopamine activity. By creating a physical barrier or obstacle between ourselves and that object of desire, we have this opportunity to think twice and also to interrupt thoughtless and automatic habits of consumption. So for example, we could throw out all the junk food from our fridge, or we could delete all the social media apps from our phone. Secondly, we got temporal restrictions. So we can avoid overstimulation by setting a timer as to when, how often and how long we can use or do something. For example, we can set a timer when playing a video game, or we can use an app like OneSec that will literally tell us to stop using our phone after a certain period of time. Thirdly, association restrictions. Basically, we want to avoid any activity that we associate with overstimulation. Sometimes certain activities will remind us of other high dopamine activities that then triggers a craving. So by avoiding those activities that trigger cravings, we can reduce the frequency of those cravings over time, improving our odds of success. For example, if you're someone who compulsively gambles, then it may make sense to avoid any card games whatsoever because that may trigger the craving for gambling. The second tool is using therapeutic pain, and we can restore our natural homeostasis in our brain by intentionally pressing down on the pain side of the seesaw. By doing this, we can undo the effects of our high tolerance for pleasure, leaving us in this neutral or normal default state instead of the painful state where we have to constantly seek out pleasure in order to achieve equilibrium. This obviously doesn't mean doing stuff that's going to cause us actual physical pain, but focusing on stuff that is going to be a little bit difficult, a little bit uncomfortable, and require a certain degree of effort. For example, going for a long run, taking a cold shower, or tackling a particularly hard work project. It may be a little odd to say that pain can be good for us, but this is actually the whole idea of the hormesis effect. According to the theory of hormesis, exposing our body intentionally to mild or moderate toxins or painful stimuli is beneficial to the body. And the reason for this is because our body senses this injury and then starts to upregulate or begin production of feel-good neurotransmitters and hormones like opioids, serotonin, oxytocin, norepinephrine, and of course dopamine. And so the final tool is prioritizing long-term rewards. So for a bit of context here, the pursuit of long-term and short-term rewards is usually handled by separate parts of our brain. Pursuing short-term rewards is usually handled by the emotional part of our brain, such as the amygdala, whereas the pursuit of long-term rewards requires effort from the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical part of our brain. And today we know from research that people who compulsively overstimulate have lower than average connectivity between their reward pathways and their prefrontal cortex. In other words, their brains are far less likely to interject with a logical argument when they end up pursuing a short-term reward, like eating a bar of chocolate, at the expense of a long-term reward, like getting in good shape. So if we're ever feeling overstimulated, we need to train our brain to reinforce the connection between our reward pathways and our prefrontal cortex by prioritizing long-term rewards. And there are a few ways we can do this. Firstly, make pre-commitments. So whenever you're building a new habit, commit to things that are hard to back out of. So if you want to exercise 3 times a week, you can create accountability by doing that thing with a friend. Secondly, minimize distractions. If your attention is constantly being pulled in different directions, it's really easy to lose focus and to fall back into automatic behaviors. And finally, reward yourself. So you can reinforce the behaviors that are most important to you by tying that thing to a reward. So if your goal is to cut back on social media, you can set a goal for yourself for the week, and if you hit that goal, you can go out for a nice meal or something like that. These 3 things have made it so much easier for me to concentrate on my work over the last few months, and have completely changed the game in my ability to focus. So I'd love to hear how this stuff helps out you guys too.